My name is Bernie Siegel. I'm the Executive Director of the Regenerative Medicine Foundation, and I'm also the founder and the founding chair of the 13th World Stem Cell Summit. Big things have small beginnings, and we remember our first World Stem Cell Summit when it was called the Stem Cell Advocacy and Policy Summit at Baylor College of Medicine in 2005. And we have expanded and expanded to a multi-track event, as many as having 8 concurrent tracks running at the same time and a global audience. This year is our first year that we are co-organizing our event with another major conference, the Facilitate Cell and Gene Therapy World and the Immuno-Oncology Frontiers World event. Of course, Facilitate is operated through Clarion Events, one of the major event companies on the planet, running 250 events a year. So I think as you enjoy this summit, if you've been to some of our prior summits, I assure you, you will be very well fed. It's a special event, and yesterday we had our super plenary session, which was absolutely marvelous. I had a chance to do a fireside talk with our friend Dr. Jean Loring and Dr. Robin Smith, and we enjoyed ourselves at the beautiful Bayside for our kickoff event, and it's been a number of tracks going on today, mainly part of the Facilitate event. This is our opening plenary session that I'm welcoming you today. And I just wanted to thank at the outset our co-organizing institutions that help guide the program every year, and our co-chairs at the Mayo Clinic, Dr. Rick Hayden, the Cure Alliance, Dr. Camilla Ricordi, the Wake Forest Institute for Regenerative Medicine, Dr. Anthony Atala, the Interdisciplinary Stem Cell Institute at the University of Miami, Dr. Josh Hare, the Maryland Stem Cell Research Fund from the state of Maryland, Dr. Dan Gensel, the New York Stem Cell Foundation, Susan Solomon, Nova Southeastern University, their Cell Therapy Institute, and the Karolinska Institute is represented by Dr. Richard Jove, Weill Cornell Medicine, Dr. Shaheen Rafi, and the University of Florida, and their new Center for Regenerative Medicine, Dr. Keith March. Also, some of our key sponsors is 5X, Dr. Tracy Armstrong, Avalon GloboCare, our new bridge to China, a public company, Dr. David Jin, and of course, we're very proud to have the editors and leaders from Stem Cell Translational Medicine, the official journal of the Regenerative Medicine, and Ann Murphy is here. So thank you all for your tremendous help and support. And when this session is done and the 2 plenary sessions are done, I want you to take a little stroll over and look at the poster sessions outside of the reception area, enjoy a glass of wine, and then those of you who are attending the awards dinner, we have a very special awards dinner tonight honoring Vice President Biden, and Jill Biden is represented by the head of the Cancer Moonshot and the Biden Cancer Institute, Greg Simon, Ed Bosarge, Adrian Shapiro. We have Dr. Shane Shapiro here, so I get my Shapiros and Shapiros sometimes mixed up, but that's the way it goes, and Shelley Ross of the Cure Alliance. So we are so happy to be here. And just to set the tone, when I went to college at the University of Miami, I was assigned a book, Future Shock, back all the way in circa 1972. And that's always been one of my favorite books. And there's a passage in Future Shock that I think kind of sets the stage of where we are today with this combination, convergence of technologies, and this great enterprise that all of us are involved in of stem cells and regenerative medicine, a curative technology. And in Future Shock, Alvin Toffler wrote, "If the last 50,000 years of a man's existence were divided into lifetimes of approximately 62 years each, there have been about 800 such lifetimes. Of these 800, fully 650 were spent in caves. Only during the last 70 lifetimes has it been possible to communicate effectively from one lifetime to another, as writing made it possible to do. Only during the last 6 lifetimes did masses of men ever see a printed word. Only during the last 4 has it been possible to measure time with any precision. Only in the last 2 has anyone anywhere used an electric motor, and the overwhelming majority of all the material goods we use in this daily life today has been developed within the present 800th lifetime. The convergence of technologies that we have today and the arc and the acceleration of this field in just the 16 years that I've been involved as devoted as a patient advocate and viewing this as a great ecosystem and a great enterprise that we're all engaged in. We now have all knowledge, human knowledge, in the palm of our hand. We have every technology available to us, off the charts. They're researching stem cells on the International Space Station. Miracles happen, and it will impact our lifetimes, certainly the lifetimes of our children and grandchildren. This will impact all of us. Very honored to have in the attending and speaking today Dr. Peter Marks of CBER, the Director of CBER at the FDA. I want to thank the United States Congress and the Senate and President Trump for allowing us to fund our government and have Dr. Marks here. I talked to them all and they straightened it out, so I just want you to know that. We're now going to start our main session, and we have I'm not going to introduce all the speakers for our opening plenary session, the Alpha Clinic, Near and Far Horizons for Regenerative Medicine. But I want to call up Dr. Anthony Atala and the panel to please come and take their seats. And Dr. Anthony Atala of the Wake Forest Institute for Regenerative Medicine is one of our co-chairs. He serves on the board of directors of the Regenerative Medicine Foundation. In fact, he created the Regenerative Medicine Foundation. I created the Genetics Policy Institute, and we had the good sense to merge them. And I'm very proud to be the executive director, and we knew when it was time to change our brand. So now we're the Regenerative Medicine Foundation. This Dr. Atala is world-renowned for his brilliant work in bioengineering, tissue engineering, and his joy in life is taking Fridays off to do pediatric urologic surgeon, where he's probably one of the best in the country. So let's welcome Dr. Atala and the rest of the panel.
Bernie, thank you so much. Thank you for your kind comments. It's great to be with all of you. And Bernie, what a great job you've done with this conference. It's amazing, you and your team. Thank you. And we really have a terrific group of panelists today, just amazing individuals, each one a leader in the field, and we're very, very excited to have this panel. I'd like to acknowledge the Regenerative Medicine Foundation, World Stem Cell Summit, and the Journal Stem Cell Translational Medicine. That's the official journal for the foundation, for their support of this session, and Ann Murphy, who's a publisher, who's here as well. Thank you, Ann. So this is great. How fun. Now, the only problem is we are having this session in front of Peter Marks. This is going to be a problem, Peter. I'm kidding. That's right. That's right. You better not listen to half what we say. But actually, it's really nice to have you, and I'm glad that you're here. So first of all, just brief introductions. Maria, do you want to start off with a brief introduction of who you are?
Sure. Good afternoon. I'm Maria Millan, President and CEO for California Institute for Regenerative Medicine. Short for that is CIRM.
Hi, I'm Joshua Hare. I'm a professor of medicine at the University of Miami and the director of the Interdisciplinary Stem Cell Institute there.
I'm Susan Solomon. I'm CEO and founder of the New York Stem Cell Foundation and our research institute, known as NICEF.
I'm Greg Simon. I'm the diversity panelist because I'm not a stem cell person. I'm the director of the Biden Cancer Initiative.
That's great. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for being here. So this is a great thing to open up this meeting with this session, the Alpha Clinic, Near and Far Horizons in Regenerative Medicine. As you know, we are now several decades into the field. Clinical trials are now, just a lot of clinical trials ongoing. And the question is, what are the concerted efforts in the field? So maybe I can start with Maria, because Maria, CIRM has been a big proponent for these clinics. In fact, the term Alpha Clinic came from CIRM. So maybe you want to tell us a few words about what was the initial concept behind the Alpha Clinic and what does it really mean?
So the name Alpha Clinic preceded my joining CIRM, but presumably Alpha was A first. But the idea behind Alpha Clinics Network is that CIRM is in the business of accelerating stem cell treatments to patients with unmet medical needs. It's funded to do that via a $3 billion bond initiative that was led by a citizen bond measure in 2004. So this is citizens of California supported this effort and created CIRM. And so CIRM funds research all the way from the early stage, discovery, to the translation stage, to the clinical stage, as well as funding the kind of the critical steps and the gaps that are needed to do that also, faculty, scientists, infrastructure. And what was anticipated in the beginning is if the goal is to get these discoveries into the clinics, then we would need a very unique set of expertise and resources to be able to do those trials well, to do them safely, coordinately with the regulatory agency to make sure that the data is captured, shared appropriately, and that we move the field forward. And so the idea for the Alpha Stem Cell Clinics was to create a learning network, a shared resource network, and a network that would be greater than the sum of its parts. And I'll just end there unless you want a little bit more description on the Alpha Clinics itself. But just suffice it to say that where we are today in 2017 is that CIRM has funded a total of 44 clinical trials in this space, in this regenerative medicine advanced therapy space, and in a diverse array of therapeutic applications, gene-modified cell therapies, cell replacement therapies, as well as therapies that have a secondary modulating effect, utilizing stem cells. And so different technology platforms and a diverse array of disease indications, and we'll get a little bit to that later. So the Alpha Clinics is a network that already has resident expertise within these institutions. There are currently 5 funded programs in this, with 6 academic institutions involved that already had their expertise in stem cells, stem cell biology, and clinical research. And the idea is that all of these academic centers, as well as their own networks, brought all of their resources and assets together to create even a more accelerated and efficient pathway, as well as creating novel approaches to the types of challenges that, that the stem cell and cell gene therapy space had made evident in the conduct of the trials.
Thank you, Maria. That's a very nice introduction to the concept from CIRM. Thank you. Josh, you're in the front lines, right? You're a cardiologist, you're out there treating patients, you have a number of clinical trials that are ongoing. Tell me, from your perspective, what do you see as a progression in terms of what you were doing 5 years ago, 3 years ago today, in terms of how you think about stem cell therapies?
I just want to echo that something Maria said, which is that I think this alpha stem cell concept really is devoted to accelerating the study and understanding of regenerative therapies and to move it down the evidence-based pathway. We're very pleased with the program we've been able to develop here in the state of Florida, right here in Miami down the road. And we have what we'd consider to be a very well-developed alpha clinic, even though we didn't have the benefit of funding from CIRM. We've had some very other sources of wonderful support. And I think the thing that we've learned the most is how having the alpha stem cell concept can be a major accelerator by allowing investigators in different disease areas to learn from what other investigators have done. So a great example was we did a very early study on myocardial infarction and showed that the patients receiving mesenchymal stem cells also had improvements in pulmonary function So that was a great accelerator for investigators who wanted to work in the pulmonary function area. And at this stage, we've been able to sort of, with that kind of domino effect, move into multiple disease areas, well over 10 different disease areas. And I think, so there's a mutually reinforcing effect of having different investigators in different disease areas work together. And I do believe that the data will generate, even though it's in different disease areas, will help in the approval process. Another very important thing about having the type of program we have is many investigators and patients have petitioned us for expanded access. So we've got quite a significant experience now with treating rare diseases in very small numbers. But what we're recognizing now is we can put the experience together in different disease areas because the commonality between the treatments is similar. So I think it's a very exciting time in the field. I think the efforts of these different programs have moved the field forward in terms of an understanding of safety, delivery, dosing, and we hope that the data we're generating will help regulatory agencies approve therapies as BLAs start to be submitted.
Excellent. We'll get back a little bit more to some of the specific treatments, but maybe we'll go to Susan now. Susan, of course, you've been now with the New York Stem Cell Foundation Research Institute for a number of years. Different focus. It's great because we have people from different walks in this panel, and you've really led a lot of efforts in your area, especially in iPS cells and other areas. What therapeutic options are you most optimistic about in the near future?
Well, it's like, in a way, it's sort of looking at, which one of your children you're going to favor. It's tough. We have 65 researchers in our institute that are employed by us, and then we have another 100 around the world, including many in California. But we also have researchers in Switzerland and Japan, all over. Together, we have about 4 trials that are in progress at our own home institute, and then another 16, actually I think it's 17, that are either in active trials, and we have one that's in a phase 2 trial in cancer, or are about to be in trials. So I think my motivation when we got started in May '05, so Bernie, I think that was the year, the '05 year, was born out of my own frustration, seeing the really poor solutions that we had for the diseases that were really devastating for people. And so we found, in order to move things ahead, we had to have an alpha clinic that is not just doing clinical trials, but is also facilitating with technology, whether it's CRISPR-Cas9, one of the inventors is one of our investigators, or optogenetics, same thing, or automation. You need that, you need the regulatory piece, you need the clinical piece, so we have clinical partners. It's a real ecosystem that you have to put together, and then you want to work with colleagues and the regulators, because I'm sure at some point we'll get to it, but stem cell tourism is a huge problem.
Thank you, Susan. Well, Greg Simon, we'll go to you now. Obviously you're with the Biden Cancer Initiative, so you're in a different field. But what can you tell us, in terms of what are, you think, lessons learned at your end with the Cancer Initiative that we could actually look at from the stem cell field and say, boy, we really should not make that mistake, or that's something we really need to be doing?
Thank you, and thank you for having me. First, to answer the other question about what's new in stem cells, you've gone from being a political problem to having the ability to cause a political problem, and that's a real passage of adulthood. Most of my political career, going back to fetal tissue, all of the debate was about how we get to the stem cell. And a number of people in Congress did everything they could to stop all of that. In the cancer world, when we were doing the Cures, 21st Century Cures Act, at the end of the Obama administration, Mitch McConnell, from one of the most evangelical states in the country, held up the bill until he got what he wanted on stem cells and the accelerated review of stem cell therapies. So I think that is a major, major change. Now, what we have done in the Cancer Moonshot and now in the Biden Cancer Initiative is held up a mirror to the cancer research community and ask, do you really want to look like this? Do you really want to look like this? The short answer that when I explained to my mother, who's 95 in 2 weeks and healthier than I am, what I do, I say I'm trying to create the cancer research system that you think we already have. And that's a shot across the bow to any new emerging science. People think that doctors share knowledge with each other when something wonderful happens. They don't. People think that anybody can get into a clinical trial if there's no other therapy for them. They can't. People think they would know about the trial even at the best institutions. They don't. People think that there are standards for pathology reports in cancer. There aren't. People think there are standards for describing a cancer. There aren't. So all of the things you think you know about the scientific system inside cancer are wrong. And yet we proceed along the same path because that's how people were trained. In the music world, if you studied with one type of cellist or pianist, that becomes the school you're in. And if you studied with a different person, that becomes the school you're in. And those people fight all the time. Oh, you shouldn't play like that, you shouldn't play like that. It's no different in science. If you trace your scientific lineage back to Harvard or to Sloan Kettering or UCSF, and that's the way they do things, that's the way you do things. But that's not necessarily the way things ought to be done if we're going to have a unified system. So at the Biden Cancer Initiative, we're focused on exactly what I just described. Standards all through cancer, which currently don't exist or they exist in too many forms. Data sharing so that we know what we know, because too many people die because their doctor doesn't know what we know. And clinical trial reforms because, and this is especially going to affect stem cells, all of my professional career, it was unethical to refer to a clinical trial as treatment. It's research. And you could only be in it with an admonition that it was not about you. You were engaging in research to help other people and future generations. That's no longer the case. In cancer, in so many areas where there is no standard therapy that works, people are told this trial is your last best hope for treatment. And it's very explicit. And that changes everything about the way we do trials, the way we talk about trials, who gets into trials, who has access to trials. And it's not that we have too few trials. We have too many trials. We have too many bad trials. We have too many marketing trials. We have too many trials that don't get properly reviewed or that don't get coordinated with other trials. For instance, I know this drives Rick Pazder crazy at the FDA. There are 1,400 trials right now in immunology anti-PD-1 drugs. How many drugs are they going to approve? Well, it ain't 1,400. I liken it to children's soccer, where everybody's on the ball and there's no one to pass to. We don't need 1,400 people pursuing anti-PD-1 drugs. We need people looking at how to standardize that process, combinations, side effects, the next generation of immunology drugs. So a little more coordination would save patients from being in controlled trials in hundreds of unnecessary trials, save time, save money, and actually make faster progress. So I'll stop there.
Well, that is excellent, I have to say. You know, Greg, you remind me of a topic that I've often, thought about, and that is actually bone marrow transplantation. Right here we have an area that was used for blood cancers, right, leukemias and other types of diseases. And if you really look at the bone marrow transplant area, it's a success story. It's really a huge success story. Right here you have blood cancers that were deadly just 35 years ago, and now 80% cure rates and 90% cure rates. So, and how did that happen? That did not happen through industry. It happened through academic centers getting together, putting a protocol in, making sure the protocol was right, getting the best of that protocol, moving to the next protocol, getting what was good and bad about that, get to the next protocol. Can we do that with stem cells? Can we do that with stem cell treatments? Maria, what do you think?
I think that statement about bone marrow transplantation, I think we're seeing that also with the regenerative medicine advanced therapies and even the recently approved therapies and CAR-T, and then the recent one with gene therapy, the Spark Therapeutics trial. Those were born out of the research in academic medical centers. Then were taken up by some smaller biotechs. And so I think there's a recognition. I remember when I first joined this field that there was a graph that showed, probably Peter knows this graph, of the number of trials that came from, of submissions that came from academic centers versus industry for regenerative medicine types products. And I would bet it was pretty similar still, although there's much more industry involvement now, which is a marker of the maturation of the field. But to your question about how the academic centers, probably in conjunction with industry partnership, and I think that this is all what networks allow one to do. If you build a really strong network that has the infrastructure and the data sharing and learning efficiencies built into the network, it's how they operate, there are a lot of advantages, major advantages to that. So within the Alpha Clinics network, the network sites as well as investigators who are looking at potentially coming in to the network or even coming in for CIRM funding actually can utilize those resources even before they start the trial. For instance, some of the patient registries with access to over 20 million medical records de-identified to kind of determine enrollment feasibility, cohort identification, things like that, has been very useful for those who are designing their trials, especially in orphan and rare diseases. And additionally, we're proud to be involved. You know, we've benefited from the 21st Century Cures Act. We thank all those who are involved in that, just really, really revolutionizing how we think about the best way to get treatments to patients. So the RMAT designation under Dr. Mark's leadership here is being really deployed very, very quickly. In fact, 12 were given out last year. The first 3 of those programs, 2 of them were CIRM programs, and out of the 12 in 2017, 3 of them were CIRM programs. And actually, within the Alpha Clinics network, 5 of the clinical trials have RMAT designations. So what happens there is this gives us a critical mass and the opportunity to have common platforms, dialogue, where we can keep getting better and better. I know Dr. Mark's team is working their hardest to review these and try to accelerate, but the materials that are provided to them, if they are brought forward in a more kind of uniform fashion that really gives the materials in a way that can be evaluated and creates conversation, and it's a learning process on both sides, we believe that that is going to accelerate it, and maybe even looking at it in terms of a platform technology based on platform technology types. So there are some common standards that all the investigators know will need to be in place, can learn in general terms from others, and bring that forward. So I do believe that there is a major role for that model that you just brought forward.
Excellent. Josh, what are your thoughts on that concept?
I think your analogy to hematopoietic transplant is very appropriate, and one of the key aspects of it that made it work so well, I think, was that there was a lot of NIH support for the groups of investigators who wanted to do those trials and really move the field forward and increase the understanding of how to do that. I think we see a shift to the positive now in regenerative medicine. One of the key components of the 21st Century Cures Act is increased funding and designated funding for regenerative medicine through the NIH. And we had the first study section was last year, which was a relatively small study section, but I think it was deemed to be very, very successful because in addition to the designated funds, institutes also committed additional funds, and an important component of that 21st century funding mechanism is matching funds. So you see, I think, a greater utilization of public-private partnerships through this mechanism, and the funding announcement just went out last week for this year's set of awards, which is going to be 5 times as much funding as last year. So I see many, many benefits of the 21st Century Cures Act for the field in terms of promoting academic consortia as well as academic industry partnerships. One of the additional benefits is our center is fortunate to be part of the NHLBI CCTRN network, and other investigators in that network are here in the audience. I think the current climate and the Cures Act has strengthened what we're able to do in the cardiovascular cell network, and we're more hopeful now that that network will be renewed in a third iteration so that the work in cardiovascular regenerative medicine can continue. So I think that the Cures Act has been very powerful to move the field forward, and I think that the timing is ideal. I think the data support this renewed interest and renewed enthusiasm for the field. And again, as I said before, I think we can envision some of the products reaching approvability now in the relatively near future. So I think there is light at the tunnel for having an approved regenerative product, particularly in the cardiovascular area.
Thank you, Josh. Susan, same question. I think it's an interesting concept, so maybe you can elaborate from your perspective.
So I think there are a tremendous number of advances that are moving towards the clinic. And I do think that, the regulatory environment now, I mean, we've found it extremely receptive. I am concerned about a couple of things that Greg mentioned. One is sharing, which I think is really a question of aligning incentives. And along with that, the number of trials. We're in a finite resource world. Different institutions, different times, different countries will find themselves with more or less resources. But we have to all be very smart about how we do our work. There is some low-hanging fruit, we believe, for evidence-based trials, certainly in the cancer area, which we've discussed beyond bone marrow transplant. We're very enthusiastic about eye trials because they've been successful with embryonic stem cells in the UK, that's been proven, and also with orthopedic injuries. But when you have to be really careful because there's a placebo effect. There's a lot that can pass a safety trial, but we also want to make sure that people are having treatments that actually will impact their lives in a positive way. And some people have said, well, you can have an awful lot of cosmetic things done. You should be able to have done whatever you want. That's that holds up until somebody's face starts having bone grow out of a strange place or something. But so I think stem cell tourism is something that we have to be really, really mindful of with all of these. I mean, in New York alone, we were just looking at this question. There are clinics within, 5 miles or less of our labs on the far west side, and it's like patent medicine. There are 100 different things, from erectile dysfunction to diabetes to orthopedic injuries to cardiac, and they have the cell for you. So, we need to have platforms where we've got common standards so people can share. We have to align the incentives so that when people do share, it's apples to apples, and then they share their data. I think we have to get to a place where, because we are resource constrained, even when we have a lot of money, where we're not doing 1,400 trials for, one particular mutation, and that involves sharing. So I think we're making a lot of progress, and I do think we'll see standard of care transplant in the eye area and also for scientifically validated orthopedics within the next very short period of time. I would say 2 years. It is certainly doable in 2 years. Whether the regulatory gods align, I don't know, but hopefully they will. But with trickier things that, Camillo and others have been working on forever, like type 1 diabetes, that's going to be longer. That's going to take a while longer.
Thank you, Susan. Greg, so back to this concept. I talked about bone marrow transplantation, but I can think of other examples in the cancer world where the same thing happened. For example, Wilms tumors, which is a pediatric kidney tumor. Same thing, right? Major success rate now. So what's the problem? Where did things break down, do you think? Because these are things that happened several decades ago. What's the problem today? Why cannot we have the same type of sharing that we did back then?
Well, we're human beings, so we tend to be irrational first and rational second, usually to defend our irrational positions. But I'll leave politics out of it for another minute or two. Let me back up a minute. We have made a lot of progress in cancer. I am a CLL survivor. 10 years ago, it would have been difficult for me to say that. I'm not only a survivor, but I had 0 problems with the treatment, and everything went according to the book. Very rare and wonderful thing that's a relatively new event. Pediatrics, children, people will do for their children what they won't do for each other and for themselves. And so we had pediatric clinical trial networks and pediatric oncology networks that tackled childhood leukemias that went from 15% survival rate to 5 or 10% who die from different leukemias. We just recently approved a new ALL treatment, which was the first one in forever, that's going to save a lot of lives. So progress happens. The question is, why doesn't more progress happen? And Susan and I were talking about the fact that we tend to get stuck in a rhythm of how long it takes to do something without ever going back and really challenging the assumption. So we tend to think everything takes a year because the appropriation cycle is a year, because the academic calendar is a year. It doesn't take a year. It shouldn't take a year for every new thing to develop to the next stage. But that's how the funding cycles work. So a behavioral economist would say, change your funding cycle and you'll accelerate research. This is true in every other field. If you have an annual requirement to send in proposals, you get more and worse applications for funding than if you have an open season all year long and people send in ideas as they come up. You get fewer and better proposals. That's not how we do it. The other thing, to be at a meta level, next month in February is always the AAAS meeting. 30 years ago, I went to the meeting in Boston to hear Stephen Jay Gould. I remember that because I proposed to my wife during the AAAS meeting, because my girlfriend wanted to go hear Stephen Jay Gould too. And so we both went to the conference, and there was a massive blizzard, couldn't leave the hotel, and I thought, no time like the present, and so I proposed, and now 30 years later. So I was thinking back to his theory of punctuated equilibrium, that there's not this constant change, there's a lot of stability and then huge change. And in order for that that to happen, you have to first have an underlying system that allows constant things to happen that create the environment for major change. That's basic research. The moonshot was criticized by some people because they said, unless you put $20 billion of new money into cancer, you're not going to change anything. Because we need to fund basic research at a $20 billion level, not a $5 billion level, which has been the budget for a long time. That may be true. I don't believe it. It may be true. But what is true is that if we don't have this robust system of basic research in which people are motivated to share their data, motivated to write impactful papers, not just papers that can get published, motivated to work with other institutions, rewarded for sharing credit, rewarded for sharing data, journals that don't lock up the data behind a paywall, et cetera, you get the idea. If we don't have that system, it makes it harder for the breakthroughs to happen. And when they do happen, they're often hidden in the chaos of that system that's not transparent. As an example, when the doctor in Galveston used Avastin on a brain cancer patient at his insistence, and it worked for that patient, that was just one doctor doing one thing with one patient. Several experts in cancer went to that doctor and said, after they found out about it, and said, that's not good enough. We have to do a trial now. And after 10 years of interim approval, Avastin finally got approved in the last few months for use in certain brain cancers. That's a long time, 10 years. You know, nobody wants to be the last person who got polio, right? Nobody wants to be the last person who dies of a cancer that somebody has figured out a year earlier. And yet, who knew? How would they know? So it's a long way of saying that it's no more complicated than pogo, if any of you remember pogo. The enemy is us. It's not that the science is so hard. It's not that these diseases are so hard. It's that the way we approach them is so hard. We don't think of ourselves as being part of a team. The old joke is, if you want to know what's going on in a lab, don't ask the person next to the person you want to know about, because they won't know. And that's sadly very true, and it's especially true in cancer. So how do we bring that back around to the right system? Well, at the Biden Cancer Initiative, we're using persuasion or brute force. Persuasion, because people do believe that Joe Biden and Jill Biden are coming at this from a truly authentic interest and have no other agenda. And brute force, because if there are some people who are starting to do the right thing and others who are not, the peer pressure eventually will get to them. And there are just some things we shouldn't tolerate. We should not tolerate not having access to your medical records quickly in digital format that you can share into a research repository. We just should not tolerate that, and we won't. We should not tolerate the same old funding system and the same old review system that cuts out women, cuts out young people, cuts out big ideas for fear of failure. So it's great that we were able to make success for pediatrics because children are a special class. But as cancer survivors, we think of ourselves as a special class. And I got my cancer at 64, not at 14. That doesn't make me any less sympathetic, I hope. And the people who don't have my outcome deserve a better system. Not just the science, but we do not have a system that helps patients walk through that journey. We're going to have a system for self-navigating cars before we have a system for navigating patients. But that's because we choose it that way. We can change that. There's no technical hurdle. I argue there's no economic hurdle. Every patient that gets a diagnosis of cancer goes blind and deaf and dumb for at least an hour. They need help knowing what to do next, what to think next, where to go next. We don't provide that help, and we have to. And then we'll have success stories like pediatrics.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg. I certainly did not mean to express doom and gloom for cancer. You know, certainly the American Cancer Society just released that paper in Cancer just 2 weeks ago, showing a 26% decrease in mortality rate in the last 2 decades. So they just published. Of course, that's early detection, early treatment. But certainly, one message here is we can do a lot better, right? We can do a lot better.
Absolutely. And I just have to, this one anecdote, I was just, one of those stories you stay in your car and listen to on the radio. Babe Sicarius, the best female, maybe the best athlete ever, after she had colon cancer, won the U.S. Open playing with a colostomy bag. Think about this for a minute. This woman had colon cancer, had surgery, was still in recovery, and won the U.S. Open. And that was only one of the things she won, and she didn't even take up golf until after all of her other achievements in the Olympics in track and field. And she did an interview with other athletes around cancer for the American Cancer Society 50 or 60 years ago. So, people have been working on this a long time.
Thank you, Greg. Well, Maria, as Greg mentioned, there are challenges with the funding system sometimes, right? But CIRM has taken some novel approaches to funding with a major track record now, $3 billion budget, et cetera. Can you tell us a few of the things that CIRM has done to actually improve funding in this area?
Sure, and really appreciate the comment about time and some artificial kind of parameters we set for ourselves. So one of the things that has occurred with CIRM as a funding agency is recognition of this artificial barrier being an impediment to accelerating stem cell treatments to patients and accelerating the research. So what we've done is create, through what was called CIRM 2.0 overhaul, is create a system where there's a predictable and recurrent funding mechanism. So for clinical trials, it's monthly submission. Because what we were finding is you learn, it's the whole idea of continuous improvement. With our early stage kind of clinical and translational awards, we found that there were some behaviors that we really needed to fix. One is that people were coming in too early. They wanted to get the grant because without the funding, because we fund the Valley of Death, a translational stage of research, they needed the funding to get the work done, but they were premature, so they had, maybe a very promising technology. The initial scientific data was sound, but in terms of the development plan or the regulatory plan or all the other pieces that it takes for it to go from the earlier stage to really be translated, they didn't quite have those all in place. So they'd come in because maybe the cycle was every 6 months or every year or, something like that. So now by having it every month, what happens is that the applicants come in when they're in a good place to come in. It's not forced. And on the other side of it, they don't have to, when they're ready to come in at time X, they don't have to wait till time Y. If time is of the essence and they're ready now and they have all the pieces in place, it's a meritorious program, very well-conceived plan, they're ready to come in, then it's available for them to come in. So there's rolling submission for the clinical programs. Another thing that we built into our operations is an operational efficiency that allows funding within 150 days from the time of application, assuming that they hit the go marks all the way through in terms of eligibility and recommendation for funding. Another piece of it is our team. Our team actually works with potential applicants on their plan even before they come in to give them a heads up about this development plan may need to have a look at, or have you really talked to your contact at the agency to determine whether this plan is going to be something that you can carry out feasibly. And so that's another piece of it in terms of the readiness and the strength of the plan. And another piece of it is that we have milestone-based payments to our grants. So the milestone-based payments really follow very logical steps. So first to even come in, there are eligibility criteria. So for instance, our translational stage awards, the ones that are proposed for development candidates, they typically, for the types of products we're talking about, wouldn't be able to come in until they've had some early indication that this is something that could be brought to a pre-IND meeting. So they have they build their plan around the regulatory, the actual process development manufacturing plan, and what their clinical target would be. And then to come in for what we call the Clin 1 stage, which is a preclinical or IND enabling stage, the requirement is they have already had interactions with the agency in terms of their project and input, and then they address those concerns within their application and so we actually have an independent review panel of experts that have a look at this, look at their response to the agency's input, look at their manufacturing plan, all that, to determine the feasibility. So we actually have time, and as you say, you drive the results. We actually have a time frame where when they come in for an IND enabling work, for instance, they need to propose work that can be accomplished to get to an IND by 18 months, within 18 months. And we put that out there as a bold kind of, stake in the ground, and in the past year, we had 3 programs that were able to achieve that under the new program. So initially, the initial signal looks good. And then to be able to come in for a clinical stage program, they've already had a lot of input. They've already been looked at in terms of, is this manufacturing plan right? Is your IND active? They can't come in even unless they have an active IND for that indication with that product. And so I think what we've tried to build into it is predictability, so that the time constraints are not artificial, and that all the components, it's a quality by design kind of approach where the input, the key input that's going to make it a success at the end of this is already in place in the beginning. So I think that is something that we've gotten feedback from our applicants and from our grantees, that having that in place. And by the way, in the meeting, the operational milestones, we put into place clinical advisory panels with external experts, consultants, patient advocates, patient representatives are on the panel, along with science officers. So together with these teams, we're looking at how the project's going, and we can help them address any bottlenecks along the way and bring expertise along the way. So if not everything works out, for the most part, though, because of a peer review process, because of how it's designed from the beginning, and because of active engagement throughout, as well as the resources, including the Alpha Clinics Network, as well as our specialized CRO partner, we've been able to improve both the speed as well as the quality of the work.
That's great. Thank you, Maria. Nice model. Certainly one that should be emulated by other agencies as well. Josh, Susan mentioned stem cell tourism. So you're, again, in an academic center. You're basically working there, doing clinical trials, doing research, seeing patients. What are your thoughts about with the speeding changes in stem cell therapies that we are actually facing? What are your thoughts about stem cell tourism, and what is it that we need to do about it?
Yeah, actually the problem isn't, the tourism isn't the part of it, because actually there are over 500 clinics right in the United States, and South Florida is one of the epicenters of that. So I think I have a slightly different view of it, because I think that the biggest driver of it is not practitioners taking advantage of people, but it's the enormous amount of unmet need that ill people experience. And I think we have to be very mindful of that people with ALS or heart failure or other terrible types of disorders feel very desperate, and if they feel that there is an opportunity for them, even if it's an unproven therapy, they're going to, I think, pursue it. I think it's highly reminiscent of the AIDS crisis in the beginning, when the antiviral drugs weren't approved yet. There was a huge desperation around getting them. So I think the solution is what we're seeing right now, which is more research, more clinical trials. I believe that most people would pursue a trial in a alpha clinic at an academic medical center led by responsible people, even if it involved a placebo control, as opposed to going to a clinic. But this is debated a lot. We have been conducting clinical trials at ISKI at the University of Miami for about 10 years now, and people are amazed when I relate to them that we've always been very rigorous about the trial design, and in most but not all of our trials have placebo control. And I've been very impressed by the fact that people would, who have all of the means to travel anywhere in the world, would submit to a placebo-controlled trial rather than going to a clinic that's offering an open-label treatment. So to me, it's highly reminiscent of cancer centers, which I think is a strong link between the Alpha Clinic and cancer centers. People need, and you made a comment was made about how we do at cancer centers tell people that this is their last chance to participate in experimental therapy as a treatment, not necessarily just as a trial. We know that we have a tremendous pipeline of technologies in numerous disease areas now, particularly regenerative medicine. And so the solution to medical tourism is to have enough clinical research being conducted so that people who have desperation due to their illness can participate in a clinical trial, even if there's a placebo control. So in my view, just to sum up my comments, I think that the clinics and the medical tourism were filling an unmet need in that there wasn't enough clinical research being done. There weren't enough clinical trials. Just one more example is in congestive heart failure, an incredibly common condition. There are relatively few options, even right now, for people to participate in a clinical trial. There's just a handful of trials being conducted, and there are, by some estimates, 8 million Americans with congestive heart failure who could be eligible. So again, I think the solution is the Alpha Clinic, is the rapid conduct of rigorous trials, adequately funded so the trials can be conducted with the sufficient speed to get the answer, and then have the regulatory interactions with the FDA to move the program to the next step. I believe anybody would prefer to be treated for congestive heart failure or cancer at a major medical center than in a clinic somewhere.
Great, thank you, Josh. So Susan, I know this is a topic that you really value, and you actually brought it up again, stem cell tourism. So how do we ensure that the treatments are scientifically valid and proven as much as they can be?
Well, I think there's a couple of points here. First, when you have desperate patients, particularly if they have resources, and then you have greedy people that want to make money, you're going to have a toxic combination of some quacks and people offering things that are not real and potentially damaging. I think yes, you've got to push on the gas to accelerate the trials. The number of trials, but they have to, I think to Greg's point, there has to be a connection, a roadmap between the person who's sick and how to figure out how to get to a trial that can potentially help them. And right now, unless you network it or you happen to know so-and-so or you're in the regenerative medicine field, it's going to be pretty tough. And there are trials, unfortunately, on the clinicaltrials.gov that are just because they're listed doesn't you can't assume that those are good trials. So I think FDA enforcement. I was pleased to see that there's going to be more enforcement. Obviously, that has to be resourced, and I'm sure that is a real challenge. But I think you both have to educate people, have more trials, and more scientific advances. I think one kind of 30,000-foot question that we're looking at, and I think CIRM has done a really good job addressing that institutionally. We try really hard, others have tried, and that is, are we ready in this field to move out of the incentives for kind of happy accidents? I mean, at CIRM, you're saying to people, the entire goal of CIRM is to accelerate treatments and cures. That's our goal. So if somebody wants to work in our laboratory, whether it's on, somatic cell nuclear transfer for, mitochondrial replacement therapy or, IPS technology, there has to be a clinical goal, even if there's a basic objective. That is, and Josh, what you're doing, I mean, that you are looking at different therapies to help people, and you're talking about how to connect people to that. That's a sea change from kind of study section as usual and happy accident basic research. So we have to decide that we really want to drive that. And I think the structures that we represent on this panel, we're not in the fashion business. We're not going to do pain until that quarterly shareholder goal has to change, and so we're going to quick flip it to cancer, which might then change to something else. There's I think a freedom to really be true to a mission that is a luxury that you have working in a nonprofit space. And hopefully we can figure out a path so that people can understand where they can actually go to get help during that period when they are, totally paralyzed, which we've both experienced. It's like, what? And then they can actually have places to go where, or someplace to check where they're not going to be ripped off. ISSCR wanted to do this, and they had to drop it because they were going to be sued by clinics that weren't happy with not being on the list, and they just couldn't manage it. So I think it's a tough thing. I don't know that we get there fast enough. I think we're doing something where we're just trying to actually promote literacy about stem cell research and regenerative medicine, and how you can actually ask the questions that can start to help you stay safe.
Thank you, Susan. Great answer. Now, Greg, certainly this challenge is not unique to stem cells, right? This has been going on in the cancer world for decades. Exaggerated claims, unproven treatments, lessons learned from the cancer field. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean...
Lay a trail.
Lay a trail. So there are fashions inside diseases. And for a long time, immunology was out of fashion. Now it's all the rage. And it will not be the last rage, because we'll find out, and we're finding out now, that some immunology therapies that work in some cancers are deadly in other cancers. That turning on the immune system may be easier than turning it off. And in fact, there's been a lot of literature that a lot of the immunotherapies can lead to type 1 diabetes. So you'll get rid of your cancer, you'll acquire type 1 diabetes. I think most people with terminal cancer would take that trade, but it's not optimum. But the immune system, the immune system approach goes back to the late 1800s with Coley's toxins. How many people have ever heard of Coley's toxins? So just as an example of how this field works, William Coley was a doctor in New York in the late 1800s who discovered that his cancer patients lived longer if they had a bacterial skin infection. And so he started giving people bacterial skin infections with harmless bacteria that provoked the immune system. That's how it worked. So the toxin provoked the immune system, which helped fight the cancer. Unfortunately for Coley, he was competing against the military-industrial complex that had just produced a whole lot of mustard gas. And they won. And so we got into the world of chemotherapy instead of immunotherapy in the early 1900s. And we've been there ever since. Now, immunology is coming back, and everybody's looking forward to the end of chemotherapy. And in fact, the incident of chemotherapy is going down in most patients, in most cancers, precisely because we've discovered we don't need to give people as much, and that immunology works much better because it builds your immune system rather than tears it down. So that cancer survivors who had chemo and radiation get later cancers because their immune system is permanently damaged. So it goes back to having an open mind, which is really difficult for scientists. Scientists are the most biased people I know because they know so much. So they don't know what they know for sure that just ain't so, to quote Yogi Berra. So scientists tend to be incredibly biased. They're the last ones to change their minds. And that's a cultural problem. It's a real cultural problem. It's taken all this time for immunology to come back. And now, as I said before, everybody's on the bandwagon, but there will be something else that we're going to need that's not immunology. And we're going to need to figure out how to regulate immunology so it doesn't eat your islet cells, as an example. The other thing is, and this goes to prevention and survivability, the biggest determinant of whether people survive cancer is insurance. So when Congress gives the NIH billions of more money, and they give the moonshot a couple $1 billion, and they include stem cell therapies in that, and then they vote on things that reduce by millions the number of people who are insured, it is a fact that a statistically significant piece of those uninsured will die from a preventable, treatable cancer because they don't have insurance and they never get checked. It's just a fact. ACS has been singing this song for years. That's number one. And number two, prevention, if you put mining waste in water, if you put more waste in the air, if you deregulate the regulation of pesticides and other toxins that are known to be carcinogenic, you can expect a lot more cancer. It's just the way the world is. And yet, we see this happening all the time. So I have an idea about the funding issue. How many of you have heard of blockchain? Okay, it's associated with Bitcoin. You've probably all heard of Bitcoin. A Long Island iced tea company added blockchain to their name. Long Island Iced Tea and Blockchain Company, and their stock went up 40% in one day. 40% in one day. So if we want to get that $20 billion into cancer or stem cell research, I suggest every lab become the New York Stem Cell Foundation and Border Wall Construction Company to get some of the $32 billion we're planning for the wall. What do you think?
I think it's really good, bioengineering. We could 3D print it.
You could 3D print it. It's a good idea. It's all about perception. And right now, people think they've done enough for health by adding a few billion a year. If people get uninsured, if we have more environmental poisons, if we're spending $32 billion on a wall, we're not there yet in terms of the cultural focus required to deal with this issue. And it's only getting bigger. All the changes in cancer, 99% of them, are from not smoking.
Thank you.
So
Greg.
we have a long way to go to get to the rest.
Thank you, Greg. Very excellent. Excellent. How do you really feel about scientists? I'm kidding. No, but point well taken in terms of bias, for sure. Point very well taken. So let me just, we have 10 minutes. So let's open it up. This is our distinguished panel up here. So let's open it up to a Q&A to our audience members. Who would like to ask some questions of our panelists? Don't be shy. Yes, Julie, Alex.
Comment and say that CERN does have a great model, and I think, it's more so that you're helping people through that model. And so there's transparency, complete transparency, so I do applaud you for that.
Thank you very much. And, we are very much looking forward to continuing to not only leverage what we have to help others elsewhere outside of California, but also to help recapitulate, or, some of that in other ways, as well as join forces. So we actually have had some very good conversations about how we can kind of standardize some of these resources and approaches, share the data in a really meaningful way. Agencies such as the FDA can help us assert discipline so that occurs. And we have, I think, a good starting point for that. So we're really looking forward to seeing, what we can do as there are more and more trials and more opportunities for this.
Thank you, Maria. Maybe this is a good time for you to maybe show that one slide. Could we put that one slide up, please, from CERM? That would be great, because maybe you want to highlight your program
I
here.
didn't know we weren't preparing slides, so I had some slides.
Okay.
But, and so in any case, I had mentioned the clinical trial portfolio, and so Tony thought it was good to have a look at this, because this is something that we're meaningfully driving. And as I said, we actually have a whole process of external peer review group of very distinguished scientists and experts in the field, both in the science of regulatory manufacturing, and also patient representatives are represented on our peer review panel. So getting through to funding is not easy, but when we come out with projects, they're very high quality, well-vetted projects. So we have a goal of 67 clinical trials by the year 2020, and that is, so just to give you an idea of how this field is really at an inflection point. I know you've heard that repeatedly, that we're at an inflection point. When we launched our strategic plan in early 2016, we had 17 clinical trials over a 10-year period that CERM had funded, and that's our business, right? We're attracting and funding them. Between the launch and now, we added an additional 27 trials, and with a goal of 50 trials in 5 years. And it looks like that's going to happen. And again, these are high-quality trials. And so I think that the discussion we're having today really speaks to the need for putting the infrastructure and the standards in now, in terms of data sharing, data systems, and all that, because it is just going to continue to grow. And this is just our experience. There's more going on, elsewhere. And so as you can see, it's a diversity in terms of clinical trial targets. We have actually a pretty, robust portfolio in the oncology space, and some of our programs that were initially funded by CERM are being used in combination therapy. So some of the PD with some of the those targeting cancer stem cells. So we're already seeing next generation. And then the CAR T therapies that were just approved, we actually have next generation of that targeting different antigens, engineering the memory T cells for persistence, and targeting solid tumor, glioma, out of City of Hope. So we actually have next-gen projects already in the pipeline.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria. We have another question, second row.
Yes, I think it's a question for the
Camila.
But I think it's great to have academic and non-profit initiative to synergize and bring people together and avoid duplication, and have like academic institution and non-profit as the gatekeeper of validating things that may be emerging also from private clinic. I don't think private clinic are necessarily that per se, but we should be in a way the panel that then validate what is a claim in a non-randomized trial, with randomized trial. But I think that the critical point is cost, and I think that a huge role that academic and non-profit initiative may have is to dampen, to reduce this cost of how much it takes, together with facilitated approval pathways. You could build the cost of bringing a new therapy from the billions to the 100 or less million, and that could have an incredible impact on actually affordability, sustainability of the whole system, and to never see again therapy approved with $850,000 per patient price tag.
Thank you, Camilo. Any
point.
comments on that? Does anyone want to comment on Dr. Camilo Ricordi's statement? Josh?
Yeah, I just want to echo what Camilo said. I think that in a model where it's pure industry, there's incentives to only go after things that clearly have a business model that'll lead to profit. I think what's unique about the regenerative medicine field is that it's, again, it goes back to the analogy of hematopoietic transplant. There isn't an obvious business model that's increasing, immediately apparent, and big pharma is nervous about it and has relatively has invested relatively little in regenerative medicine. So it's incumbent upon academia to drive this, and I think a lot of the models of doing clinical research in the academic rubric do drive down costs. I think this is a big motivator around the CTSI program of NIH, is to create networks, academic networks that can have academic public-private partnerships, but that model does allow for much greatly reduced costs at developing therapies, and developing therapies in some areas that are very unusual and new and don't have a clearly apparent business model, but that may be very important to certain patient groups.
Thank you, Josh.
Tony, can I make a comment about CRISPR?
Yes, please do, Greg.
So all the debate about CRISPR is the same debate we had 30-something years ago about genetic engineering after the Boyer-Cohen patent. Hasn't really changed. The debate has not changed, just the technology has changed. People who opposed genetic engineering 30 years ago oppose it today. Facts don't matter. People who oppose genetically modified organisms in the environment or cows treated with bovine somatotropin who opposed it 30 years ago oppose it today, even though there's not been not one adverse human event from eating genetically modified foods. Not one. Peanuts are a huge killer, not genetic engineering. So you get to CRISPR, the companies don't want to be the ones, same as stem cells, they don't want to be the ones to make the mistakes to find out it didn't work, which is where academics come in. And in CRISPR, not only are we talking about changing you, but now we're talking about being able to change your children and your children's children. So I did an experiment when I gave a talk on CRISPR to a group of CRISPR scientists. And I asked them to hold their cell phones up and to hand it to the person behind them for the duration of my talk. They refused to do it. They were so freaked out to trust the person behind them with their phone for 20 minutes, literally. And I said, so you don't trust the person behind you with your phone, but you want me to trust you with my genes. We have a little work to do on how we think about this before we deal with all of this.
That's great. Greg, thank you. I knew it was a good idea to have you in this panel, so this is great. Thank you.
Tony, I
yes,
just wanted
Marianne.
to make again, in follow-up to Camilo's comment, I think absolutely. So I think one of the things that is important is to not waste the investments that have been already made. So for instance, CTSIs have been a great starting point and have actually being leveraged into our Alpha Clinics network. Some of the shared resources we have in our Alpha Clinics, such as shared IRB reliance, where there's concurrent IRB approvals at all the participating sites, came out of a UC-wide, UC braid system. So it's a matter of what are all the pieces. So, are you a renovator or do you want to build everything from scratch? So we're kind of doing both, right? We're renovating when we know that there's already some valuable assets there, and then we're also building upon that as a necessity. And another thing I wanted to make a point of is that all the programs we fund in the clinical arena are not just California trials, for the very reason of if we're accelerating the field, and we also have to be mindful of responsibility to California taxpayers who are funding this, but the California taxpayers funded it to move the field forward and to increase access to transformative treatments. So we have within our portfolio non-California trials where the California components are supported by us, and we actually have international trials within our networks as well.
That's great.
But I think to the point that that you're making, Greg, it's in order for people to use a lot of these tools, right? I think what you've done is provided all of the things that you need. Nobody hands people a book and a class how to set up a lab, right? So you don't get a class unless you have a great tech transfer person who is interested in what you're doing, who's actually going to tell you after you have your Nature paper what has to happen. People have no clue. But I think there's a huge issue, and it's an issue of, does everybody have to invent their own technology to do something? I mean, we saw that when we pioneered automated derivation and differentiation of stem cells. We didn't do it because we happened to like automating things. We did it because we wanted to have foundational resources so that somebody who is, working on, diabetes in one laboratory and somebody working on diabetes in another laboratory, and they're using iPS cells, then they have an apples-to-apples comparison. But it's really human beings. Human beings are problematic, and so we have to just remember that. We have opinions.
Thank you, Susan. Okay. In the last, I don't see any more questions from the audience. So I'm going to ask you one last question in 5 words or less. Tell me, what are you most excited about in RegenMed? Who wants to go first?
We should start on the end of
I'll start at that end. Greg?
Okay.
Well, that's not fair. Josh, do you want to go first? 5 words or less.
I'm just excited to see phase 3 clinical trials being done.
Good. Excellent. Susan?
I'm excited to see the whole field actually getting serious about making things happen for patients.
Thank you. Greg?
You're ready for your close-up. You've been the 10-year from now thing for a long, long time.
Yeah.
That's over. You're here now. You had major legislation held up because of you. People are expecting big things. So that's what I mean by close-up.
Thank you. Maria?
I'm very excited that there's more discussion about how we're going to cover this for patients. Again, speaking to the maturity and the promise, it's not just an untethered hope, as we say, that it's actually here, and now we need to do it the best way we possibly can. It's less than 5 words, but the first part was just 5 words, right?
Thank you.
Tony,
Okay.
I just want to say one thing, which is I remember when we started in 2005, Shaheen Rafi, who I don't know if Shaheen is here but is going to be here, kept saying that it was not ready for prime time. That was his expression. Right. But I think it actually is ready for prime time now.
Terrific. Thank you. I would like to again thank Bernie Siegel, the Regenerative Medicine Foundation, Ann Murphy from the Stem Cells Translational Medicine Journal, and our panelists, Maria Millan, Josh Hare, Susan Solomon, Greg Simon. Thank you all so much for being with us today. Thank you.